The Korthani homeworld's capital city stretched beneath two amber suns, its crystalline spires catching the light in patterns that hurt human eyes if stared at too long. Dr. Ethan Blake adjusted his diplomatic credentials for the 15th time as he approached the Terran embassy, trying to project the kind of confidence that came with advanced degrees in xenoanthropology rather than the nervous energy that came with being completely out of his depth. His appointment as cultural attaché represented the culmination of 8 years of academic study and theoretical preparation for first contact scenarios, but walking through streets filled with beings whose social dynamics he understood only from research papers made him realize how little academic theory prepared someone for the reality of alien civilization. The embassy's orientation briefing had been thorough. Korthani society functioned on complex hierarchical structures where personal magnetism served as a form of political currency, where the ability to command attention reflected leadership potential, and where proximity to powerful individuals indicated your own social worth. What the briefing hadn't prepared him for was the immediate, overwhelming presence of Princess Nyala Veltar. She entered the diplomatic reception hall like a force of nature given elegant form, her silver and gold ceremonial robes flowing around her with movements that seemed choreographed by laws of physics that applied only to royalty. Her pointed ears, swept back in graceful curves that suggested both alien heritage and aristocratic breeding, tracked the emotional atmosphere of the room with subtle precision that marked her as someone accustomed to reading political undercurrents. Ethan found himself cataloging details with the analytical distance that academic training had taught him to maintain. The way other diplomats unconsciously oriented themselves toward her position, how conversations shifted to include her perspective even when she wasn't directly participating, the subtle deference that marked her as someone whose attention was valuable currency in this particular social ecosystem. Ambassador Chen performed the introductions with diplomatic precision, presenting Ethan as the embassy's newest cultural specialist while Princess Nyala studied him with silver-flecked eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of his appearance and bearing. "Dr. Blake," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that made his name sound like something more significant than mere identification. "Ambassador Chen tells me you're here to study our cultural preservation methods. I'm curious about your perspective on the intersection between individual expression and social obligation." The question was clearly designed to evaluate his intellectual capabilities rather than make small talk, and Ethan felt his academic training engaged despite the overwhelming alien setting. "Your Highness, that intersection represents one of the most fascinating aspects of Korthani society. The way individual creativity serves collective identity while maintaining personal authenticity suggests a social evolution that human cultures are still trying to achieve." Princess Nyala's ears shifted slightly forward, indicating what Ethan had learned meant focused attention. "An interesting observation. Tell me, Dr. Blake, how do human cultures balance personal desire with communal responsibility?" The conversation that followed lasted nearly an hour, with Princess Nyala demonstrating knowledge of human psychology and social theory that rivaled his own academic understanding. Around them, the diplomatic reception continued, but Ethan noticed that their discussion had become the center of attention for both human and Korthani observers. What he also noticed was the way Princess Nyala gradually reduced the physical distance between them as they talked, her movements so subtle that he might not have detected them without his training in nonverbal communication analysis. By the time she suggested they continue their discussion in the embassy's cultural archive, they were standing close enough that he could smell something like starflowers and ozone that seemed to cling to her ceremonial robes. "Your Highness, I appreciate the invitation," Ethan replied, taking a small step backward to restore professional distance, "but perhaps we could schedule a formal meeting where proper diplomatic protocols could be observed. I wouldn't want to monopolize your time at a reception intended for multiple cultural exchanges." Princess Nyala's expression flickered with something that might have been surprise. "Dr. Blake, I am perfectly capable of managing my own time allocation. If I choose to focus my attention on our conversation, that reflects my evaluation of its value." "Of course, Your Highness. I simply meant that as a representative of human cultural interests, I should ensure that our interactions follow appropriate diplomatic procedures." Ethan maintained his respectful tone while subtly repositioning himself to include other diplomats in their conversational space. Perhaps we could arrange for additional cultural attaches to participate in future discussions, to provide broader perspective on the topics we're exploring. The confusion that crossed Princess Nyala's features was immediately concealed by diplomatic training, but Ethan caught enough of it to realize that his response wasn't what she'd expected. Around them, he noticed other embassy staff exchanging glances that suggested they were witnessing something unusual, though he wasn't sure whether the unusual element was her invitation or his deflection. Ambassador Chen appeared at his elbow with the timing that came from decades of managing diplomatic complexities. Your Highness, Dr. Blake, I hope you've had a productive introduction to our cultural exchange objectives. Very productive, Princess Nyala replied, though her attention remained focused on Ethan with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. Dr. Blake has provided fascinating insights into human social dynamics. I look forward to continuing our discussions through appropriate channels. The reception continued around them, but Ethan found himself hyper-aware of Princess Nyala's presence throughout the evening. She moved through the diplomatic gathering with practiced grace, engaging various representatives in conversations that demonstrated her knowledge of multiple cultures and political systems. What struck him was how every interaction seemed calculated to maintain a specific image while gathering information that might prove useful later. More interesting was the way other attendees responded to her proximity. Human diplomats competed subtly for her attention, each trying to demonstrate their value through clever observations or useful information. Korthani nobles positioned themselves to be included in her conversations, their body language suggesting that association with her reflected their own status. Even the embassy staff seemed more alert and professionally polished when she was nearby. Ethan maintained his position on the reception's periphery, observing the social dynamics while fulfilling his obligation to be available for cultural questions. His academic training had taught him to analyze social structures from a position of professional distance, and the current gathering provided excellent opportunities to study Korthani hierarchy behaviors in action. He was surprised when Princess Nyala approached him again near the reception's conclusion, her movement through the crowd causing subtle shifts in attention that marked her progress across the room. Dr. Blake, she said, positioning herself at a distance that was closer than diplomatic protocol strictly required but not quite close enough to be inappropriate. I find myself curious about your research methodology. Most cultural attaches seem eager to integrate themselves into local social structures to gather first-hand experience. You appear to prefer observational distance. Ethan considered his response carefully, recognizing that she was probing for information about his professional approach. Your Highness, I find that maintaining analytical distance allows for more objective evaluation of cultural patterns. Excessive integration can compromise the researcher's ability to recognize behaviors that participants take for granted. Interesting perspective, Princess Nyala replied, her ears angling in a way that suggested she was processing his explanation for implications beyond its surface meaning. And do you apply this observational distance principle to all your cultural interactions? Professional obligations require certain boundaries, yes. Ethan kept his tone neutral, though he was beginning to suspect that their conversation had implications beyond cultural research methodology. Effective cultural analysis depends on maintaining the perspective necessary for objective evaluation. Princess Nyala studied his face for a moment that stretched longer than diplomatic conversation typically allowed. Dr. Blake, I suspect your approach to cultural research will prove illuminating. I look forward to observing how your methodology develops as you become more familiar with Korthani social structures. As she moved away to rejoin her official entourage, Ethan found himself wondering whether he'd just passed some kind of test or failed to recognize an opportunity that every other diplomat in the room would have seized immediately. The way other embassy staff were looking at him suggested that something significant had just occurred, though he wasn't entirely sure what. Ambassador Chen approached as the reception began winding down, his expression carrying the kind of professional concern that suggested private conversation would be required later. Blake, he said quietly, I hope you understand that Princess Nyala's attention represents a considerable opportunity for advancing human Korthani cultural relations. Of course, sir. I'll certainly make myself available for any official cultural exchange programs she might wish to establish. Ambassador Chen studied his face with the expression of someone trying to determine whether his cultural attaché was being diplomatically naive or strategically cautious. Blake, I think there may be some aspects of Corthani royal protocol that warrant discussion in tomorrow's briefing session. As Ethan prepared to leave the embassy that evening, he found himself thinking about Princess Nyala's questions and the curious intensity with which she'd studied his responses. His academic training had prepared him for complex cultural dynamics, but something about their interaction suggested layers of meaning that standard xenoanthropological analysis might not be equipped to decode. The most puzzling element was the way she'd seemed simultaneously intrigued and frustrated by his maintenance of professional boundaries, as if his restraint represented a behavior pattern she'd never encountered before. Ethan had the distinct impression that his assignment as cultural attaché was going to prove considerably more complex than his academic preparation had suggested. The embassy's morning briefing room felt smaller than usual as Ambassador Chen spread diplomatic schedules across the conference table, his expression carrying the kind of professional concern that suggested Ethan's cultural orientation was about to become significantly more complicated. Blake, Ambassador Chen began, consulting his tablet with the efficiency of someone who had managed impossible diplomatic situations for 2 decades, Princess Nyala has requested your participation in a series of cultural exchange events that will require careful navigation of Corthani royal protocol. Ethan felt his stomach tighten as he reviewed the proposed schedule. Private tours of restricted cultural sites, invitation-only artistic presentations, exclusive academic symposiums that typically included only the most influential members of Corthani society. Every event represented the kind of access that cultural attaches spent years trying to achieve, and Princess Nyala was offering it all with the casual authority of someone accustomed to reshaping diplomatic schedules according to personal preference. Sir, this level of cultural access is extraordinary. I'm honored by Her Highness's interest in advancing human understanding of Corthani traditions. Ethan paused, processing implications that seemed to expand faster than his diplomatic training could handle. However, I want to ensure that my participation doesn't inadvertently create any protocol complications. Ambassador Chen's smile carried the weight of experience dealing with diplomats who didn't recognize opportunity when it was hand-delivered by alien royalty. Blake, Princess Nyala's attention represents the kind of cultural breakthrough that could advance human Corthani relations by decades. I trust you'll approach these opportunities with appropriate flexibility. The first cultural exchange event took place in the Royal Archive, a crystalline structure that housed thousands of years of Corthani artistic and philosophical development. Princess Nyala served as personal guide, her knowledge of the collection demonstrating intellectual depth that made Ethan's academic credentials feel like elementary education. This sculpture represents the Corthani concept of individual expression within collective harmony, she explained, gesturing toward a piece that seemed to shift and flow despite being carved from solid stone. The artist achieved recognition not through rebellion against social structures, but through finding unique voice within accepted frameworks. Ethan studied the sculpture, his analytical training engaging with the philosophical implications. The technical skill is remarkable, but what strikes me most is how the individual elements enhance rather than compete with the overall composition. It suggests a social evolution where personal authenticity strengthens rather than threatens collective identity. Princess Nyala moved closer to examine his expression as he analyzed the artwork, her proximity creating awareness that had nothing to do with cultural research and everything to do with the way her attention made him hyper-aware of his own responses. Dr. Blake, your analysis demonstrates understanding that goes beyond surface appreciation. Most human observers focus on technical complexity without grasping the underlying social philosophy. Your Highness, I find that cultural artifacts reveal the most interesting insights when examined for what they suggest about the values that created them. Ethan realized they were standing closer than professional distance strictly required, and took a small step back to restore appropriate spacing. Perhaps we could examine some examples that illustrate different approaches to the individual-collective balance you mentioned. He noticed the way her ears shifted slightly backward at his movement, a response he was beginning to recognize as indicating either confusion or mild frustration. Throughout the tour, she continued to position herself at distances that felt more intimate than diplomatic while he consistently maintained professional boundaries through subtle repositioning and redirection of attention toward the cultural materials they were ostensibly there to study. The pattern continued through subsequent events. At the artistic presentation, Princess Nyala secured seating that placed them side by side while Ethan suggested including other cultural attaches to provide broader human perspective on the performances. During the academic symposium, her invitations to private discussion were met with his requests to schedule formal meetings that included appropriate diplomatic oversight. The breaking point came during a reception at the Korthani Cultural Ministry, where Princess Nyala's growing frustration with Ethan's maintained distance finally overcame her diplomatic training. She had spent the evening watching him interact with other attendees, polite, professional, intellectually engaged but emotionally reserved with everyone. What appeared to puzzle her was why someone would consistently choose boundaries over opportunities for closer connection with alien royalty whose interest was obvious to every observer present. Dr. Blake, she said, approaching him in a section of the ministry's archive that provided privacy from other reception attendees, I find myself curious about your research methodology. Ethan felt the shift in her tone, recognizing that they had moved beyond cultural exchange into territory that his diplomatic training hadn't adequately prepared him to navigate. Your Highness, I hope the cultural materials we've examined have provided useful insights into human analytical approaches. The cultural materials have been illuminating, Princess Nyala replied, positioning herself close enough that her presence dominated his sensory awareness. However, I am more interested in understanding why you maintain such consistent distance from opportunities for deeper cultural integration. Her silver-flecked eyes studied his face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle that defied familiar analytical frameworks. Every other human in your embassy seeks my attention, every Korthani noble competes for my notice, yet you maintain barriers as if proximity to me were somehow dangerous. Do you find me lacking in some way that others do not see? The directness of her question caught Ethan off guard, revealing frustration and confusion that her royal training couldn't quite conceal. He realized that his behavior represented a completely foreign response to someone accustomed to commanding attention through presence alone. Ethan considered his response carefully, understanding that his answer would either clarify their professional dynamic or create diplomatic complications that could affect human-Korthani relations far beyond his individual assignment. Your Highness, he said, his voice carrying the thoughtful consideration that characterized all his diplomatic interactions, I maintain distance not because I find you lacking, but because I believe you deserve to be valued for your intelligence and leadership capabilities rather than pursued for your status or beauty. Princess Nyala's ears went completely still, a response he'd never observed before. Every person who seeks your attention wants something from you. Validation, advancement, or the power that comes with royal favor, Ethan continued, his academic training providing structure for concepts he'd never articulated before. I choose distance because it allows you to be yourself rather than the prize others compete to claim. Because your ideas deserve to be evaluated for their merit rather than their source. Because respect sometimes requires restraint rather than pursuit. The silence that followed stretched long enough for Ethan to worry that he'd committed some profound violation of diplomatic protocol. Princess Nyala stared at him with an expression that cycled through surprise, confusion, and something that might have been wonder. You maintain distance, as a form of respect, she said finally, her voice carrying harmonics he hadn't heard before. I maintain distance because I believe genuine respect requires recognizing someone's autonomy and inherent worth rather than treating them as an opportunity to be seized, Ethan replied. Your Highness, your attention is valuable precisely because you choose where to direct it. My restraint is my way of ensuring that any interaction we have is based on your genuine interest rather than my presumption of entitlement to your time and consideration. Princess Nyala's expression shifted through emotions too complex for his human understanding to fully decode. When she spoke again, her voice carried a quality he'd never heard from her before, vulnerability mixed with something that might have been relief. Dr. Blake, in my entire life, no one has ever suggested that my attention was something to be earned rather than claimed. No one has ever prioritized my autonomy over their own desires for advancement or association. Her ears betrayed uncertainty despite her controlled tone. Are you saying that your professional boundaries are actually protective of my position rather than dismissive of it? Ethan felt something shift in the space between them, a recognition that their conversation had moved far beyond cultural exchange into territory where his answer would define everything about their future interactions. Yes, Your Highness. That's exactly what I'm saying. For the first time since he'd arrived on the Korthani homeworld, Princess Nyala's smile carried no calculation, no diplomatic purpose, no strategic objective. It was simply the expression of someone who had discovered something she hadn't known she was looking for. Dr. Blake, she said softly, I think I am beginning to understand why your research methodology might prove more illuminating than I initially anticipated. The Joint Human-Korthani Cultural Preservation Project occupied a crystalline workspace that adapted its configuration to accommodate both species' optimal working conditions, with gravitational fields that adjusted to individual preferences and lighting that shifted spectrum based on task requirements. Ethan found himself genuinely excited about the research possibilities as he reviewed data streams that represented the first comprehensive collaboration between human analytical methods and Korthani historical archives. What made the project even more valuable was working with Princess Nyala in a context where their interactions were governed by professional objectives rather than diplomatic protocol. Their conversation in the Ministry archive had created an unexpected shift in their dynamic, transforming her from a royal presence requiring careful navigation into a colleague whose intellectual capabilities matched his academic interests perfectly. Dar. Blake, your pattern analysis algorithms have identified correlations in our historical data that our own researchers missed entirely, Princess Nyala said, manipulating holographic displays that showed cultural evolution trends across multiple centuries. The way human computational approaches complement Korthani intuitive analysis suggests possibilities for enhanced understanding that neither species could achieve independently. Ethan felt the satisfaction that came with productive collaboration as he watched their combined methodologies reveal insights that validated his theoretical approaches to xenoanthropological research. Your Highness, the historical depth of Korthani record-keeping provides context that human analysis typically lacks. We can identify patterns, but your cultural understanding explains what those patterns actually mean. They worked in comfortable synchronization, their different perspectives creating analytical frameworks that enhanced rather than competed with each other. What struck Ethan most was how Princess Nyala's behavior had changed since their conversation about his respectful distance. Instead of the calculated grace he'd observed at diplomatic events, she displayed genuine intellectual curiosity, asked questions that revealed authentic interest rather than strategic information gathering, and expressed opinions without apparent concern for how they might be perceived or used by others. Ethan, she said, using his personal name for the first time, may I ask you something about human social dynamics that has been puzzling me? He looked up from the data analysis he was conducting, noting the way she positioned herself across the workspace table in a configuration that facilitated conversation without crowding his personal space. Of course. You mentioned that most people who seek my attention want something from me, validation, advancement, association with royal status. Is this different from normal human relationship patterns? Princess Nyala's ears angled forward with the focus that indicated genuine curiosity rather than diplomatic probing. Do humans typically form connections based on mutual benefit rather than authentic compatibility? Ethan considered the question, recognizing that she was asking for insight into human psychology rather than cultural research data. Humans form relationships for many reasons: emotional connection, shared interests, mutual support, physical attraction, social convenience. The complications arise when the relationship serves one person's needs while exploiting the other's vulnerabilities or resources. And your culture has developed ways to distinguish between authentic connection and exploitative manipulation? Some people develop those skills. Others learn through experience that's often painful. Ethan realized they were having the kind of personal conversation that his maintained boundaries had been designed to avoid, but the professional context made it feel safe rather than inappropriate. Your Highness, may I ask why this interests you? Princess Nyala's expression grew thoughtful as she considered her response. Because I am beginning to realize that I have very little experience with relationships that aren't based on some form of transaction. Royal training teaches us to evaluate every interaction for political implications, to assume that everyone has ulterior motives, to maintain emotional control because vulnerability can be used against us later. She gestured toward their collaborative workspace, her movement encompassing the research materials and analytical displays. This project is the first time in my adult life that I've been able to work with someone whose interest in my ideas isn't influenced by my royal status. Your respectful distance created space for authentic intellectual exchange that proximity-based relationships never allowed. Ethan felt understanding settle into place as he recognized the implications of what she was describing. You're saying that my boundaries allowed you to trust that our interactions were based on genuine professional interest rather than personal agenda. I'm saying that your restraint gave me something I didn't know I was missing, the opportunity to be valued for my thoughts and capabilities rather than my position and appearance. Princess Nyala's ears betrayed vulnerability that her diplomatic training had never allowed her to show before. For the first time, I can express genuine opinions without calculating how they might be used to manipulate me later. I can ask questions without worrying that the answers will be used to exploit my ignorance. I can be intellectually curious without fear that curiosity will be interpreted as weakness. The workspace fell silent except for the ambient hum of alien technology processing their research data. Ethan realized that their collaboration had become something more significant than cultural exchange. It had become an experiment in relationship dynamics that neither of them had intended but both were finding valuable. Your Highness, can I tell you something that might explain why I approached our interactions the way I did? Please. My academic training taught me to recognize power imbalances in cultural exchanges, where researchers could inadvertently exploit the trust of people who were sharing their knowledge and traditions. Ethan moved around the table to access a different data display, his movement bringing him slightly closer to where she sat without crowding her space. When I met you, I recognized immediately that your position created a power dynamic where any attempt to pursue personal connection could be interpreted as seeking advantage through royal association. Princess Nyala's expression shifted as she processed this explanation. You were protecting both of us from the complications that would arise if your professional objectivity were compromised by personal involvement. I was trying to create space where we could interact as intellectual equals rather than as cultural researcher and royal subject. Ethan realized his voice carried more personal warmth than diplomatic neutrality, but the professional context made emotional honesty feel appropriate rather than dangerous. I wanted you to be able to trust that my interest in your knowledge and perspectives was genuine rather than strategic. And now? Princess Nyala asked, her silver-flecked eyes studying his face with the intensity he'd learned to associate with her focused attention. Now that we've established professional collaboration and mutual respect, do you think those boundaries are still necessary? Ethan felt his heart rate increase as he recognized that their conversation had reached a point where his answer would determine the future of their relationship. I think that depends on whether we can maintain the trust and mutual respect we've developed while exploring different types of interaction. Princess Nyala's smile carried genuine warmth rather than diplomatic calculation. Dr. Blake, I would very much like to discover what authentic personal connection feels like with someone who has demonstrated that they value my autonomy enough to prioritize my comfort over their own desires. In that case, Your Highness, perhaps we could begin by using each other's personal names more often. And maybe. Ethan felt courage he hadn't known he possessed. Maybe we could have dinner together sometime as colleagues who enjoy each other's company rather than as diplomatic representatives fulfilling official obligations. Nyala, she said, her ears reflecting contentment he'd never seen from her before. And yes, Ethan, I would like that very much. Though I should warn you that I have very little experience with relationships that aren't based on calculated advantage or political necessity. That's okay, Ethan replied, feeling something warm and hopeful settle into place between them. I have very little experience with alien princesses who value intellectual authenticity over royal deference. I think we can figure it out together. As they returned to their research with new understanding humming beneath their professional collaboration, both of them realized that the strength of restraint had created something far more valuable than proximity could have achieved. The foundation for connection based on genuine respect rather than convenient attraction. And when Princess Nyala's hand briefly touched his as they reached for the same data display, neither of them pulled away. The boundary had served its purpose and evolved into something else, the beginning of chosen connection rather than circumstantial proximity. The Korthani Royal Council chamber buzzed with political undercurrents that made Ethan's diplomatic training ping with warnings about conversations he wasn't qualified to navigate. Princess Nyala, as she'd asked him to call her in private, sat across from him at the conference table with the composed expression that marked her return to royal protocol mode, though her ears betrayed tension that had nothing to do with their research presentation. High Counselor Thuren, whose advanced age and ceremonial scarification marked him as someone who had survived centuries of political maneuvering, addressed their cultural preservation project with the kind of attention that suggested implications beyond academic research. Princess Nyala, Dr. Blake, your collaborative analysis has produced insights that exceed our expectations for human Korthani intellectual cooperation, he said, manipulating holographic displays that showed the statistical results of their work. However, the Council has concerns about the personal dynamics that appear to be developing alongside your professional collaboration. Ethan felt his stomach drop as he realized their relationship had attracted political attention that could complicate both their positions. Beside him, Nyala maintained perfect diplomatic composure while her ears indicated the kind of stress that came with having personal choices subjected to governmental evaluation. High Counselor, Nyala replied with measured formality, Dr. Blake and I have maintained appropriate professional boundaries while developing intellectual compatibility that enhances our collaborative effectiveness. Any personal regard that has developed stems from mutual respect for each other's capabilities and integrity. Counselor Thuren consulted data displays that probably contained more information about their interactions than either of them would have preferred. Princess, the Royal Council has received a formal proposal from the Valkyrie Consortium regarding your potential marriage alliance with Prince Kethran. The timing of this human cultural exchange has created complications for diplomatic negotiations. Ethan felt something cold settle in his chest as he understood the political forces that were about to reshape Nyala's choices in ways that had nothing to do with her personal preferences or their developing relationship. High Counselor, Ethan said, his voice carrying professional control despite the personal implications, if my presence has created political complications for Her Highness, I am prepared to request immediate reassignment to avoid any diplomatic difficulties. The silence that followed stretched long enough for Ethan to recognize that his offer to withdraw had revealed exactly how much their relationship had come to mean to him. Nyala's ears went completely still as she processed the implications of his willingness to sacrifice their connection for her political position. Dr. Blake, Nyala said carefully, her royal training providing structure for emotions too complex for diplomatic expression, your reassignment would compromise the cultural preservation project at a critical juncture. The research we've developed requires both our perspectives to maintain analytical integrity. The research could be continued through remote collaboration or transferred to other qualified personnel, Ethan replied, though every word felt like emotional surgery. Your Highness, I would never presume that my professional interests should influence your political obligations or personal decisions. High Counselor Thuren observed their exchange with the attention of someone evaluating political calculations that extended far beyond individual preferences. Dr. Blake, your willingness to prioritize Princess Nyala's governmental responsibilities demonstrates understanding of diplomatic complexity. However, the situation is more nuanced than simple reassignment could address. He activated additional displays that showed interspecies cooperation statistics and political trend analyses. Your collaborative work has attracted attention from multiple governments interested in the applications of human Korthani intellectual integration. The Galactic Cultural Council has expressed interest in expanding such programs, pending evaluation of current experimental results. Nyala leaned forward with sudden understanding. High Counselor, are you saying that our research project has become a test case for broader interspecies cooperation initiatives? I am saying that the success of your collaboration has political implications that extend beyond individual choices or traditional marriage arrangements. Counselor Thuren's tone carried the weight of decisions that affected civilizations rather than personal relationships. Princess Nyala, you have demonstrated that royal leadership can adapt to include partnership with other species without compromising Korthani cultural integrity. Dr. Blake, you have shown that human intellectual contributions can enhance rather than threaten our traditional knowledge systems. Ethan felt understanding dawn as he realized the political landscape had shifted around their relationship in ways that created possibilities neither of them had anticipated. High Counselor, what exactly are you proposing? I am proposing that Princess Nyala's choice between traditional marriage alliance and innovative interspecies partnership represents more than personal preference, it represents Korthani society's choice between familiar limitations and unprecedented opportunities for cultural advancement. Nyala's ears reflected emotions cycling between hope and disbelief. You're saying the Royal Council would support my choice to pursue relationship with Ethan rather than accept the arranged marriage proposal? I am saying that the Council recognizes that true leadership sometimes requires choosing the future over the familiar, Councillor Thurin replied. However, such choices must demonstrate benefit that justifies political complexity. Your relationship with Dr. Blake would need to serve broader diplomatic objectives rather than merely personal satisfaction. Ethan looked at Nyala, seeing royal authority wrestling with personal desire in ways that reminded him why he'd initially maintained respectful distance. The last thing he wanted was to become another factor that complicated her choices or compromised her autonomy. Nyala, he said, using her personal name despite the formal setting, whatever you decide needs to be based on your own values and priorities. I won't influence your choice by expressing preferences that might override your own judgment. Her smile transformed her entire expression, revealing the warmth and intelligence that had drawn him to her beyond all considerations of status or political advantage. Ethan, that's exactly why I want to choose you. Because you consistently demonstrate that you value my autonomy more than your own desires. Because you've shown me what it means to be respected for my thoughts rather than pursued for my position. She turned to address the Royal Council with the authority that marked her as someone born to leadership. High Counselor, I choose to pursue partnership with Dr. Blake, with the understanding that our relationship will serve as a model for human Korthani cooperation and a foundation for expanding interspecies diplomatic programs. 6 months later, Ethan stood in the newly constructed Interspecies Cultural Institute, reviewing applications from human and Korthani researchers who wanted to participate in collaborative programs based on the methods he and Nyala had developed. Their relationship had evolved from professional distance through respectful friendship into partnership that strengthened rather than compromised their individual capabilities. The latest cooperation statistics are remarkable, Nyala said, approaching with data displays that showed integration success rates exceeding all previous interspecies collaboration efforts. 12 different human Korthani research partnerships have been established, with preliminary results suggesting that our analytical methods are broadly applicable across cultural research disciplines. Ethan smiled, pulling her close enough that their connection hummed with shared satisfaction and genuine affection. Think we've proven that restraint can be a foundation for deeper connection rather than a barrier to it? I think we've proven that the strongest relationships are built on respect rather than proximity, Nyala replied, her ears reflecting contentment and confidence in equal measure. And that sometimes the most valuable connections are the ones that prioritize the other person's autonomy over your own immediate gratification. Through the Institute's viewing ports, they could see the Korthani Royal Council chamber buzzed with political undercurrents that made Ethan's diplomatic training ping with warnings about conversations he wasn't qualified to navigate. Princess Nyala, as she'd asked him to call her in private, sat across from him at the conference table with the composed expression that marked her return to royal protocol mode, though her ears betrayed tension that had nothing to do with their research presentation. High Counselor Thurin, whose advanced age and ceremonial scarification marked him as someone who had survived centuries of political maneuvering, addressed their cultural preservation project with the kind of attention that suggested implications beyond academic research. Princess Nyala, Dr. Blake, your collaborative analysis has produced insights that exceed our expectations for human Korthani intellectual cooperation, he said, manipulating holographic displays that showed the statistical results of their work. However, the Council has concerns about the personal dynamics that appear to be developing alongside your professional collaboration. Ethan felt his stomach drop as he realized their relationship had attracted political attention that could complicate both their positions. Beside him, Nyala maintained perfect diplomatic composure while her ears indicated the kind of stress that came with having personal choices subjected to governmental evaluation. High Counselor, Nyala replied with measured formality, Dr. Blake and I have maintained appropriate professional boundaries while developing intellectual compatibility that enhances our collaborative effectiveness. Any personal regard that has developed stems from mutual respect for each other's capabilities and integrity. Counselor Thurin consulted data displays that probably contained more information about their interactions than either of them would have preferred. Princess, the Royal Council has received a formal proposal